Now, does this new system make the path to a 70 or even 100% rating for a mental health condition easier, harder, the same?
We've got to see how it actually plays out. My impression is that it's going to make it easier for people to hit 70%. And I pick on 70% in particular for a couple of reasons. The VA is relatively liberal. I hate to use that word because I know it has some political connotations, but they're relatively easygoing, if you will, about granting mental health condition ratings at 30% and even 50%. It has traditionally been quite difficult to get them to grant a rating at 70%, particularly for someone who's employed. It's been really very difficult for people who are employed. I think that's the subset of people who are going to be most beneficially impacted by the new regulations. The last jump above 70%, as you know, is all the way to 100. For a 100% rating, a person has to be really pretty severely impaired.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Tony Francis Jackson.
So today we have some good news.
That's a rarity on Victory Over VA. So welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an update that could change your life. I'm Kristian Terison, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system, though. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who served. So stick around, because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. So, what is the good news?
The good news is that the VA is changing the regulations regarding the ratings for mental health. Now, you know that in some recent episodes we've talked about some possible bad news, ratings about sleep apnea, ratings about tinnitus, but in the mental health changes, I think these are actually going to be genuinely beneficial to veterans who are seeking service connection for mental health.
So, mental health tends to be one of the most underrated and underclaimed categories of disability in the whole VA system. Why do so many veterans either or not file or end up with, lowball ratings from the VA?
Well, the first part is harder to answer. I don't know why so many veterans don't file. My impression from people I've talked to is that a lot of veterans are embarrassed to file mental health claims. They see it as a condition that is stigmatized, that is, kind of swept under the table. Nobody's proud of saying, hey, I'm crazy. And that's the assessment that a lot of these veterans are making about their symptoms, I'm afraid. I've had people who clearly were eligible to file mental health claims and just wouldn't do it. And we've had some veterans who have filed mental health claims, but have been very unwilling to disclose the severity of their symptoms for fear that they would be institutionalized. Now, as you and I know, VA records, in fact, are protected by statute. It's very difficult for anyone to get access to those records. It takes at least a court order, and it's just difficult. But there are veterans who fear that their symptoms are so severe that if people knew how bad they were, they would be involuntarily hospitalized. I think that's part of it.
So under the current rating system, how does the VA rate mental health conditions, and what are some of the common complaints about that system and how it's failing our vets?
Well, taking the first half, the VA's general mental rating formula right now focuses primarily on impact on work. I mean, it talks about both social and occupational functioning, but it really, in terms of severity ratings, in terms of getting higher ratings, focuses primarily on the impact on the ability to work. Now, there are certainly cases, and you and I have both seen them, where people are still working and get relatively high ratings, 50%, even 70%, while they're still employed. But that's the exception and not the rule. As a general proposition, people who are working will be rated at 30%, occasionally 50%, but rarely higher.
So with the new system, what are the 5 domains of functional impairment, and how does that depart from the way VA has been rating?
Well, the domains they're using now in this new rating system are cognition, thinking, interpersonal relationships, that's essentially your social functioning, and then task completion and efficiency, that's kind of the work piece. Self-management, your ability to, control yourself, discipline yourself, move through the day without being distracted or otherwise impaired by your mental health symptoms. And then what they call resilience and adaptability, which is intended to focus on people's capacity to sort of deal with the symptoms and bounce back and move on.
So the current system has, as you've mentioned, been criticized for being too fixated on occupational functioning.
Right.
What makes that a particularly flawed lens for looking at mental health impacts for vets?
Well, you have to start with the proposition that the system was originally built with the thought that the compensation was compensation for your loss of earning capacity. So the focus has always been, or the underlying focus, I mean, the individual pieces don't always reflect it, but the underlying focus of the entire system was to what extent has your ability to work and earn been impaired, and how are we going to compensate you for kind of the generic level of that loss. The system never looked at the difference between someone who was losing 20% of their capacity to work at $50,000 a year versus someone who was losing 20% of their capacity to work at $250,000 a year. But the underlying thinking, the focus, the conceptualization was always about impairing the ability to work. So the problem with that in the mental health area is that there are people who are severely impaired in terms of their mental health who have managed to hang on to a job, and there are a variety of reasons for it, but most commonly it's because they are employed in a setting where they can reduce the friction, if you will, that comes from their mental health symptoms. For example, lots of long-haul truck drivers have PTSD problems, and PTSD problems usually are most evident in terms of interaction with other people. So you get somebody who's doing a long-haul truck driving job, comparatively speaking, across the workforce, that's a job with relatively low social interaction. You're not with 50 other employees, you're not trying to keep up with the production line, you don't have a boss leaning over your shoulder and yelling at you. It's relatively low interpersonal friction. So that is part of the picture. Another part of the picture is that either because of their veteran status or because of family relationships or friendships, a lot of folks with mental health problems have found jobs where people will kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, give them a little extra leeway, kind of cover for them a little, so there are all of those things. But the reality is that if you took those folks and did a psychological or psychiatric evaluation and said, is this someone who is severely impaired by their mental health symptoms? The answer would be unequivocally yes, they are.
So correct me if I've got my understanding wrong, but it sounds like under the new system, there would be a minimum 10% rating for all service-connected
Yes.
mental health conditions?
That is correct.
So that's a pretty significant change.
That is a huge change.
Who does that impact the most?
My impression, we haven't seen this play out in practice yet.
Sure.
But my impression is that the people who are going to get the most immediate benefit from that are folks with service-connected physical issues, particularly chronic pain type issues or other, orthopedic conditions that cause pain on movement, that sort of thing, who have depression because of their pain and their limitations, and are kind of going to be sort of almost automatically given a 10% rating, even though they're not really pushing a mental health claim. That's my best guess. It may prove to be something other than that, but that's my best guess, just trying to project into the future.
Sure. Well, and I can think of a number of veterans who've come to us with a 0% service-connected mental health claim, where for whatever reason, the CMP examiner or what have you said, oh, yes, they've got XYZ mental health condition, but it doesn't actually affect them day to day.
Right.
So I think that would be a boon for them as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Now, does this new system make the path to a 70 or even 100% rating for a mental health condition easier, harder, the same?
My impression, again, we've got to see how it actually plays out. My impression is that it's going to make it easier for people to hit 70%. And I pick on 70% in particular for a couple reasons. The VA is relatively liberal. I hate to use that word because I know it has some political connotations, but they're relatively easygoing, if you will, about granting mental health condition ratings at 30% and even 50%. It has traditionally been quite difficult to get them to grant a rating at 70%, particularly for someone who's employed. It's been really very difficult for people who are employed. I think that's the subset of people who are going to be most beneficially impacted by the new regulations. The last jump above 70%, as you know, is all the way to 100. For a 100% rating, a person has to be really pretty severely impaired.
Extraordinarily, in my experience.
That's right. So I don't think you're going to see the progression to 100 change much, because those are the folks who are already in such dire straits that they're not able to work in most circumstances, and so even under the current system where work is a primary criterion, they're still going to get to 100. But the place I see that I think there's going to be a real difference is the 70% category. And as you know, but not all our listeners may know, 70% is a huge, huge milestone in the VA's rating system, because 70% for a mental health condition, just by itself with no other ratings, makes you eligible to be considered for TDIU, or individual unemployability. So the fact that this will make more people eligible for 70%, I think, is going to be a real game changer in a lot of ways. And frankly, one concern that I have is I think it's going to cost the VA a lot of money in benefits, and I'm afraid we are reaching a tipping point where the sheer volume of cost of VA disability benefits is going to force a political change on the entire VA disability compensation system, just because that number is getting to be such a big percentage of the non-discretionary spending in the government's fiscal budget.
Sure. One could argue that shouldn't have deployed so many folks to so many places if you can't justly compensate them for what they've experienced.
Unfortunately, it is not my experience that people think about those costs when they're deploying the troops.
Truly.
It's the people who are cleaning up 20 years later that have to think about the costs.
Yeah, after the deploying authorities have long since retired.
Yes.
So who should specifically be re-examining their mental health claims?
I think anyone who is currently at 30 or 50% is struggling to work and is having particularly social interaction problems. You know, they've been divorced once or twice or three times. They're struggling in their current relationship or have no current relationship. They're having a hard time getting along with fellow employees at work. I think those folks should be at the head of the line to get evaluated under the new criteria.
As we've talked about in other episodes, C&P exams can really be the crux of a mental health claim. Just briefly, what are some common mistakes there, and what are things veterans can be doing to make sure those exams go?
I think the biggest single mistake that I see, and it's especially true in mental health, it's true across the board, but especially in mental health, is people downplaying their symptoms. You know, I can't tell you the number of hearings our firm has had, I've had personally, and I know you've had, where you put the veteran on to testify, and he says, oh yeah, well, I have a little problem. Sometimes I get a little grumpy, you know, and you put the wife on and she said, a little grumpy, you know, he punched a hole through the wall the other day, you know, he threw his best friend down the steps because he just blew up and got angry. You know, it is so common in VA, especially in C&P exams, for people to understate the severity of their mental health symptoms. It's just painful. You know, in almost every VA hearing for mental health that I did, I would try to get someone other than the veteran to come in and talk about the severity of the symptoms, because so often the veterans have this mentality where I've got to keep a stiff upper lip. I'm not going to tell people that I'm hurting. I'm going to be the tough guy. And they just downplay and understate the symptoms. And, you know, the examiner certainly is going to be looking for that, but it's hard for an examiner to appreciate how much people are downplaying their symptoms. I think examiners often look for cues that people are downplaying their symptoms, but to quantify the level of severity of that is very difficult if people are minimizing the symptoms.
We're almost out of time for today, but just briefly, this is something that we probably see more as attorneys reviewing evidence than a lot of veterans would realize, but the private providers, when they're documenting mental health symptoms and things like that, tend to use different language than what the VA is looking for within their ratings. What is a strategy to effectively bridge that gap between, you know, your private healthcare records using sort of one set of words to describe it, and the VA looking for other particular terms to get you to an appropriate rating?
Well, I think there are a couple ways to do that. Obviously, one is to work with an expert who has a lot of exposure to this kind of VA disability work and is familiar with the kind of the key concepts. But the other way is to use the VA's own disability questionnaire forms. And the significance of that is that the VA actually has a system for scoring those forms that feeds into the severity analysis. So if you get the private practitioner to not only provide a report but also to fill out the VA's DBQ form, then that helps to push the private practitioner to put things in the format and in the categories that VA is looking for when they're organizing their rating.
And this may have since changed, but last I knew, the VA was not making those DBQ forms publicly available. Is that still the case?
They're not, but they are still publicly available. You can find them on the internet.
Yeah. I just wanted to save some veterans some aggravated clicking around va.gov looking for something that's not there.
As far as I know, they haven't put them back up. But they don't. There was talk at one point of VA refusing to accept DBQ forms from non-VA providers. They have not, to my knowledge, gone that far. And if you provide the form, it still goes into the mix to be looked at. But you're right that they have tried to discourage and minimize the ability of outside providers to access the forms.
And that should tell you all you need to know about how effective they are at connecting mental health symptoms to the benefits that you deserve. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in to Victory Over VA. Please be sure to like and subscribe and join us again next week.
Hope to see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.